Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Herbert joins me from the YouTube channel Herbetech, and we're going to dive into Bash scripting today and some kind of powerful things you can do with it. It's definitely going to reveal my incompetence when it comes to Bash scripting, but that's okay. We are here to learn. But before we kind of dive into that topic, Herbert, could you give just a brief background on yourself, just to give a little bit more context to this conversation?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you, Ryan, for having me on. It's a real great pleasure to be here. I'll give a little background on myself. So I have been in the IT industry since 2009. So in 2009, I started actually working at the local computer shop as a apprentice. So I did some sort of apprenticeship. That's like a program we have here in Belgium. So I didn't go the classic college uni route. I just went straight into working at the age of 18. And then I did like 3 years of in the IT shop, just doing simple computer repair. And we also have like a separate branch where we do business. So where we do the business customers, and that just involves things like Windows Server, things like Microsoft 365. So that's where my career actually started. And then after that, I was kind of bored of it because also like skill-wise, I did reach my ceiling after a few years, and I noticed that the company wasn't really going anywhere. So I thought to myself, well, let's go the Linux route. And that's when I started looking for jobs for junior Linux system engineers. And that's, by the way, for some people who might want to be Linux engineers, it's actually something that you just have to dive into. Not a lot of people can get there's not a lot of people who can get a lot of experience in Linux. So it's just best for you if you have some experience in IT to just go into like junior roles. They're quite desperate to find Linux engineers anyway, so they're probably going to be glad to take you on and teach you. And so that's the thing that I did. And in my first job, I actually went and learned a lot about Ubuntu systems, like Ubuntu operating systems, Ubuntu Linux. We were running like Docker containers, things like that. And after a few years also, I decided that I wanted to go the freelance route. And that's where I ended up my first freelance gig in one of the biggest banks here in Belgium. And that's when I started looking into things like Red Hat, Oracle, SQL, things like that. And after that, at that same company, I did a different role. I went into like data center automation, things like automating stuff like services and appliances within the data center, automating all that stuff with Python. And this year I did another gig. So now I'm working at a new customer, or like freelance customer or freelance client. And now I'm doing more of the same, like more of that Red Hat flavored operating systems, like the Red Hat type operating systems. And we're doing a lot of OpenShift. We're doing a lot of AWS. And so that's where I'm at right now.
Awesome. Quite a extensive background.
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting that you shifted to kind of more freelancing and stuff like that. Maybe if we have time here at the end, we'll touch on that just a little bit, as I'm
definitely.
sure that's a route that a lot of developers at least consider. And I'd be super interested in like what your experience has been and maybe some pros and cons of that. So we'll kind of pocket that till the end and see if we have some time for that. But I was hoping today to talk about kind of Bash scripting, as you have a great kind of tutorial. I found it through Free Code Camp, and you kind of go over Bash scripting. And I know for me, as a kind of self-taught front-end developer, I didn't really dive into Bash scripting or really the terminal a whole lot. And like for me, selfishly, it's going to be very helpful to kind of learn this. And as I kind of go throughout my kind of full-time career here, I'm noticing more and more that having some skills when it comes to the terminal and Bash would definitely be helpful. And kind of learning this, it definitely does come in handy. So I think a good place for us to start here is like, first off, just what is Bash scripting? What are we talking about when we say Bash scripting?
So Bash scripting, if you put it in a simple way, basically when you're working with the Linux terminal, you're putting in a lot of commands. And following those commands can be things like conditionals and stuff like that. And it's actually like the combination of those conditionals and the commands that you are writing that comes together in something called a Bash script. And that Bash script just has a lot of like logic in it. Like there's Things like, oh, look, if this file exists, then don't create a file, and if it doesn't exist, you create that file. Write this output of this command to that file if it exists, and if it doesn't exist, then create the file and then write it. Stuff like that. So it's actually just the idea of the stuff that you do on a daily basis in Bash, in Linux on the command line. You just write that in a script, and that just becomes an automated way of doing all those actions. And it just has a lot of that logic built in. So that's the idea behind bash scripting, is that you make it easy for yourself, and also it should be, of course, should be the idea that you save a lot of time by writing those shell scripts, because you save a lot of manual actions by doing that.
Gotcha. So kind of similar in a way in which you can write like a Python script or a JavaScript or something like that. You have this language that you can place certain logic and then it kind of runs automatically. You can do a similar thing within the terminal using Bash. And is it correct to say that Bash is like a programming language that you can use in the terminal? Or how would you kind of differentiate Bash from like something like Python or JavaScript or something like that?
Yeah, like if you would look at something like Bash, for example, it's considered a programming language, but it's not really meant to do any type of program creation like you would with Python. You can't really write software with it. It's more meant to control the software or the operating system with it. So that's the idea behind the shell. Of course, the shell is the interaction with the operating system itself, like the human interaction. That's how humans interact with the operating system itself. And the idea behind the shell scripting language is that you actually make it easier for yourself to automate those things. But the idea behind so the difference between Python and Bash would definitely be that Python can be created to make websites. It can be created to do like data science, stuff like that. That's a little bit of a limitation with Bash. It's really specialized. It's really like specialized to do operating system stuff. And it's also going to be like the better choice if you're going to be doing system tasks, if you're going to be doing operating system level stuff. Bash is going to be more optimized for that in comparison to something like Python. Yeah.
Perfect. And you kind of mentioned a few things there on why Bash would be useful when it comes to like operating system stuff and maybe automating some different tasks and stuff like that. But what are some maybe use cases of when you would use like a Bash script, or why might this kind of come in handy for someone to know?
Well, the thing about Bash is that, as I previously mentioned, it's more optimized for operating system level stuff. So if you're doing more of operating system type stuff, you would definitely prefer to use Bash. Although that's kind of debatable because it's still like a language that is a lot harder to write. But I would definitely say when it comes to operating system level stuff, you would most likely prefer something like Bash over Python. But Python is definitely a lot easier to write to be exact, actually, because not only does Python do a lot of stuff better than Bash on file level. So if you're going to be doing a lot of stuff like parsing text, for example, Python is probably going to be a lot better at that than Bash is. But of course, you're not going to be doing any like system management stuff like managing services. That's something that you'll probably do with Bash, preferably, actually.
Perfect. I think that gives kind of a good idea on what Bash is and why someone might find it useful and where they would kind of use it.
I would also want to add also that Bash is also going to be better when it comes to like stability, because it's going to be the good thing about Bash is that it's installed on all the Linux type operating systems. And when you have something like Python, you need to make sure that, when you're using something like, let's say, a module called Paramiko, which is like an SSH module for Python, you need to make sure that those modules are always up to date. And you need to make sure that when you're deploying that script to different servers, you need to make sure that all of those modules are also installed on those servers. And that's not the case with Bash. With Bash, you're pretty much sure that your script is going to run on all the systems.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a really good benefit of it. And in your video, not only do you cover some benefits of Bash, but you also kind of cover some reasons why someone might not use bash, or some potential downside. So what might be some of those, some reasons why someone might not go that route?
Well, Bash is not the easiest language to write code in, especially if you're doing stuff like error handling. Python is a lot better at that. If you're going to be creating a long script and you want to make sure that the script returns the right error messages, stuff like that. In Bash, you're gonna have to know things like all the error codes when you're running a specific command. The command can have specific error codes, and those can be sometimes a little bit confusing. But when you're doing it with Python, you're gonna have like different exceptions. You can try and catch those exceptions. Also, things like newer tools like Ansible, for example, are pretty much already replacing Bash scripts everywhere, especially because the idea behind Ansible is that it's easier to, if you have a large company at least, and you want to do a lot of automation, it's going to be easier for your company to standardize everything with one tool. And I think that the best way to do that is, by having something that is easy to write. And I think Ansible is going to be a lot easier to write. It's probably going to be a bit easier to maintain if you standardize everything. So yeah, I don't see a lot of Bash scripts anymore right now. I definitely see more Python scripts and Ansible, and that's just because, standardization, I think, and modernization. And I think also that a lot of people find it a lot easier to just write Ansible with regards to, easiness of writing. Yeah.
Yep. And I definitely think that's, one reason why, kind of as a more early career developer, I haven't really dove into kind of bash scripting and stuff like that as of yet, because as you mentioned, for a lot of use cases, like you're kind of covered by either Python or a different tool like you mentioned. But I still think that kind of having a good understanding of how to use the terminal and even bash scripting or whatever kind of use case of the terminal you want to do, it does come in handy from time to time, because like you mentioned, there are situations in which just using the terminal is easier and does make more sense than kind of writing out a Python script or something like that. So
definitely.
Awesome. And I think kind of with that, now we can maybe transition into kind of bash itself a little bit and some maybe kind of things that you can do with it when it comes to some different commands and stuff like that. So what are maybe just like a few basic commands that you often use when using bash, and what can you kind of do with those commands?
It's hard to actually like pinpoint specific commands that I use often, but I can definitely pinpoint a few features that I use a lot. And I think that the most useful feature is definitely learning about return codes, learning about redirection, because I always think like, okay, we're using these modern tools. We're using Python, for example, but let's just say that we have like a blank server and it doesn't have anything installed. It doesn't have Python installed. It just has a clean setup. It just has like Bash installed, and maybe it does have Python installed, but let's just say that if we're writing code in Python, we often use like virtual environments just to separate those different modules from each other. But a good idea would be like using error codes to differentiate between to know if a specific module is installed in our virtual environment, see if the virtual environment is actually already created, things like that. I can just imagine, and that's something that I do a lot when I deploy stuff, when I deploy Python scripts. I always deploy those scripts with bash scripts, because bash is very good at doing those kinds of stuff, because this is typical like operating system level. We're looking if packages are installed, we're checking error codes, and that's something that you just deploy with bash. Let's just say that you create a script and it uses a lot of modules. Well, you just tell bash to make sure that conda is installed. Then you just tell it to check if conda is initiated by doing conda init. Then if you look into things like packages, you make sure that you ask conda to scan for packages and to check if all the packages are installed. And that would be like an entire shell script of like maybe like 10 lines. So it's not really that of a complex script, but it just involves all those different things like error handling, conditionals, things like that. So very hard to really say like there's a specific command that you should use because all of the commands are useful. But definitely looking into things like redirection, return codes, and also like text filtering, using the grep command to just filter out specific texts, using the set command to replace specific things, specific text in your text files, and using things about like regular expressions with set, and things like learning how the different service management systems works, like SMCTL and initd. But that's more of like general Linux knowledge. That's not really related to shell scripting. But those are like different things that you're going to be using a lot when you're using Bash. And if you're using Bash, I would always say like try to do the things that are managed on a system level, and don't try to do things like learning how to. Don't dive too deep into like text replacement and stuff like that, because there's other things, other languages like Python who are gonna be a little bit better at that.
Absolutely. And one thing that you kind of mentioned there was using conditionals. So does that kind of allude to that you can maybe use these conditionals when writing a bash script, similar to how you'd use conditionals in most other programming languages? And do those kind of look pretty similar? Is it like if this, then do this, and then you might have elif and else, or how does that kind of look in a shell script?
Yeah, so the conditionals work pretty much the same. You just have an if statement, and then you have an else if statement, and then you have a final else statement if none of the previous cases match. So you have that the same way in Bash as you do with other programming languages. The only difference is that Bash is typeless, so it doesn't differentiate between like a string or a dictionary, or it doesn't even have dictionaries. Well, it kind of does, but I'm not going to go too deep into that. So it can differentiate between a lot of stuff. So it doesn't have types. It doesn't have types, so it doesn't differentiate between numerical and alphabetical characters. But it sort of does in a way. So you can actually make it compare like numerical values with each other. It does differentiate in that specific that specific thing. It does differentiate, but it doesn't really have like types like you have in JavaScript or in Python. Everything is just a string, pretty much. Yeah, that's how Bash does its thing, and that's really like the reason that it's not really meant to be used in very complicated stuff. So
Gotcha. So it doesn't necessarily have similar data structures to something like Python, in which you would have like sets, dictionaries, and I'm guessing it also doesn't have arrays and kind of lists as well.
it does have arrays,
Okay.
but it doesn't have dictionaries. So maybe I'll get into it anyway. So it does have arrays. So Bash does have arrays. So you can just have an array and they're just separated by spaces. But they don't have real dictionaries like in Bash 4.0. And I had to look this up. I didn't know this myself because I just looked at the questions you sent me. It does have some sort of dictionary, and it's named, I have to look it up here, and it's called an associative array. So that's what it's called in Bash. And it's actually just an array with a lot of, with some variables set in it. So usually when you set a variable, you would do like variable name equals the value. But in those associative arrays, you would just have an array of all of those assigned variables, if you know what I mean. So we just have a bunch of we just have a bunch of assigned variables in one array. That's how I read it. Might be wrong here, but that's how I read it at least. So it does kind of have it, but it doesn't really have it.
Right.
Yeah.
So to me, it sounds like kind of a way to hack their arrays into objects a little bit.
They did a little bit of trickery there.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, in JavaScript, arrays are actually objects. So there's a little bit of trickery going around all over the place. Cool. So with that, you also mentioned using variables. So it sounds like Bash, you could also use different variables within it. And are those similar to like Python? Do you just kind of declare some name and use the assignment operator and equal sign and assign it to some value? Or how does that kind of look within a bash script? Very similar?
Yeah, it looks similar. So in Python, I think you can, I think you have to space it out. So you have to do the equal sign space, or you can do either without spaces. But in bash, you don't use any spaces. So it's variable equals value. So it's actually without any spaces or anything between it.
Similar to maybe like in .env file or something like that.
Yeah,
Where
yeah, I think that would be a good comparison. Yeah.
Gotcha. Perfect. So you have variables, you have arrays and strings, and you can also use conditionals. Can you also do looping within a bash script, like a basic for loop?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can loop through arrays. You can loop through lines of text. You can loop through standard output. So if your command outputs something to the terminal, you can pipe that into a for loop, for example. Well, you don't pipe it into it. You would just use an, I don't know what it's called. It's like, I don't know exactly what it's called. Just to like $, open the brackets, and you put your command in between that, and then you loop through that command, through the output of that command. So anything that has a new line, it can loop through new lines of text, and it can also loop through arrays. Yeah.
And one thing that you mentioned there was piping. And I know that, for me, it's like, okay, looping makes sense, variables make sense coming from other languages and stuff. But when I hear about piping or even getting into like positional arguments and stuff like that, it's a little bit more tricky. So what do you mean when you say you could pipe it into a function, or what does piping even mean?
So piping is actually the practice of sending the standard output. So when you execute a command, you would get, usually in your terminal, you'd get an output. But by using that pipe symbol, you can send that output into another command. So for example, if you use a grep command by default without piping, the grep command will just, you give it a file, and then you give it something to filter or search for. And then it will just print out those values in that text file. If you would grab the output, let's just say that you do a PS command, which just displays all of the processes running on the server. You can pipe that into a grep command, and then you can filter through whatever it is that you're looking for. Let's just say that you have a bunch of processes running on your server. You can pipe that into the grep command, and then you can type in something like, oh, I want to find something, MySQL, for example. I will just look for that keyword for that specific word in that output. And that's how you actually use piping.
Gotcha. So you can have a command, and then you can return or have some output of that command. And then piping is when you take that output and you basically send it to a different command and use it within that command. Does that sound right?
That's about right. Yeah.
Gotcha. Perfect. Well, now I will have at least somewhat understanding when my engineering manager says, yeah, you could just pipe that command into this little thing. I'm just
and
like,
it's one of those,
okay.
It's one of those things that is used most often as a system engineer in Linux. You pipe stuff from here to there.
Well, that's super helpful for me. And one thing that you also mentioned in your video was kind of using positional arguments in your command. So I think that this is related to like, often you might write, even when using like, git commit, you might use -m and write a commit message. So is that like -m, say you're going to add a positional argument, or what are kind of positional arguments?
Yeah, that might be a good explanation. But positional arguments are basically when you write a command, and you write the command and you put something behind it. So let's just say the positional argument 0 is always reserved for the command itself. And then positional argument 1 is anything you put behind that command, right? So let's say that I do echo, which is the easiest command someone would ever have to write, because that's the typical hello world example. If you would type echo and then you type hello world, then hello world would be a positional argument for that echo command. See? So that's like, it takes in, so echo command takes in an unlimited amount of positional arguments. And so then if you type hello world, that would be, hello would be positional argument 1, world would be positional argument 2. And if you would put it into quotations, then the whole string becomes like one positional argument.
And one last question on bash scripting before I ask pros and cons about being a kind of more freelance developer. Does bash scripting, I think you mentioned piping it into a function, which makes me feel like it does support functions and you can reuse logic and create different functions within a bash script. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you can write functions in bash as well. And functions, so like a little bit of a difference maybe between functions and stuff like Python or JavaScript is that functions, they don't take in variables assigned or wherever you are, like a keyword assignment or keywords that you pass a function. They just take in positional arguments. So you just write the function and then you can tell the function, hey, whatever comes after the function is going to be positional argument 1, and then anything after that, number 2, stuff like that. And of course, when you're building functions that take in a number of arguments, you make sure, of course, that you build in some logic that they can only take in that amount of positional arguments. But generally, yeah, they do support it. Of course, they don't support things like methods, so they don't support things like object-oriented programming. That's not really supported in bash. I've seen some people who did it with some trickery, but it's not really like a vanilla vanilla object-oriented programming that you can do with bash. Yeah,
more of a kind of hacky way to
like they did with the dictionaries.
The array. Yeah. Gotcha. Cool. So to me that makes sense, as when you were talking there about using the echo command, you'd say echo and then add your positional arguments. My like mental model for that is thinking about echo as kind of like a function, and then you're kind of using those positional arguments as adding arguments to kind of that function there. Yep. So it sounds like you can do a very similar thing with the own functions that you create, and you would kind of call them a very similar way. Does that sound like a fair mental model there?
Yeah, exactly. I think that sounds about right. Yeah.
Well, I think that covers bash scripting really well, but I'm definitely also interested in some pros and cons that you kind of noticed when kind of going the freelance route for your job and everything, as I'm sure it's something I've considered, and I'm sure it's something that people listening to this consider as well. So maybe just real quick here, what are some maybe benefits that you notice from that? And maybe also, I'm sure there are maybe some downsides of that as well.
So it's definitely like maybe hard to compare like Europe with the US, for example. But I do notice that for me personally, it's financially it's a lot more interesting. Especially because for me personally, we pay taxes depending on the amount of profit we make each year. So I can do a lot of investing in myself, because if I invest in myself by studying or buying books, like I have this book over here, like I don't know if you can see it, the Linux Bible. Yeah, it's my I
was gonna say, I think I could make out Linux, and that was
yeah. But anyway, I buy a lot of those books just because I learned a lot of them from them. And also I buy a lot of courses. Like 2 years ago, I went on a boot camp to the Netherlands with like hotel room included, and it's all paid for by my company. And those are things that you can't really do, or at least you get to have like permission from your boss to go on those kinds of boot camps. And that's one of the things that I really like the most, that I have this freedom to invest in myself. And anything that I do on a daily basis, I can reinvest in myself, and then on a later basis, I can up my daily rate, because that's how I work as a system engineer. Like, I don't know if for developers specifically, freelancing might be a little bit different, but for system engineers, at least, we do like corp to corp. And that's like you sign a contract with the company and you work your standard 40 hours per week. Like you do it any other 9-to-5 job. You just do your 9-to-5 job, but you just have your company being paid instead of you being paid personally. So that's one of the also like the freedom that you have. Like tomorrow, when my contract would be ending, for example, it's like only like a month of I don't know how you call it in English exactly, notice period, I think it is. So before you leave the company, yeah. So it's only like a month for me Whereas if I would be doing standard payroll kind of work, I'll be looking at least like 6 months or so if I would be at a company for long enough. And so it also gives me the freedom to switch around very easily. Yeah. So that would be definitely for me the biggest benefits.
And are there any downsides that you noticed with going that route, or has it kind of just been, pretty nice and definitely glad you kind of went that route?
Maybe a little downside to it is that if you don't work a day, you don't get paid. So that's one of those downsides. And another downside is that my LinkedIn profile and my phone is always red hot, glowing red hot with people calling me for new opportunities, like consultancy firms that are always calling me for new opportunities. Even people who they notice that I'm a Linux engineer and they send me opportunities to do replacing desktop computers somewhere. And I'm like, have you read my profile?
Yeah.
But yes, they just have to try, right? So they're just doing their job. So that's not really that bad at the end of the day.
Yeah, not the worst problem to have if you're so in demand that your phone's ringing off.
Yeah, it's one of those. Yeah, it's like one of those non-issues. Like you're so much in demand that you don't have to worry about ever losing your job or something like that. Or
yeah, definitely. I could totally see how it would be an inconvenience, but not the worst inconvenience to have. So I think with that rounds up our discussion very well here. Where can people go to kind of learn more about what you're doing? I know I mentioned your YouTube channel a little bit earlier, but where can people kind of go to kind of see what you're up to online?
They can go to my YouTube channel, and that's actually basically the only place I post. I don't do any social media stuff because I noticed that there's not really the audience for it on Facebook or Instagram or stuff like that. So I just do YouTube nowadays. So you can go to my YouTube channel, check it out. I have a lot of stuff on there. I have been a little bit inactive on there, but that's because I'm doing some renovation on my house. I'm very busy on that right now. So definitely when that's all done, I'll do a video on my new studio that I'm creating, that I'm making there. So still a long way to go, but definitely when it's all finished, I'll start posting again. And I think it's going to be great with the new studio and all. So
awesome. Well, I know for me personally, I'll definitely be subscribed and waiting for that kind of studio update to come in and all that stuff. So awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on today. I definitely learned a lot from kind of our discussion, and I'm sure everyone listening did as well. So thank you so much for coming on today, Herbert.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. You're welcome.